Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics and can be heard live every Thursday evening here on the Inception Radio Network. If you've been listening to the show, you know that one of our sponsors, well, it would be me, offers a training program that teaches you to be a medical intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner. That would be the Institute of Applied Energetics. And if it's something that you've been interested in doing, starting a new career in the health world, please do check out the website, www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. We are offering a summer blowout sale. And so, if it's something that you're interested in doing, like I said, this would be the time to take advantage of what the offers that we have. I cannot speak tonight. As you know, or as you may not know, if you're a first-time listener, Just Energy Radio can be heard on our website, www.justenergyradio.com, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep you informed of the upcoming guests, or you can friend us on Facebook, which will keep you up to date with everything happening here at Just Energy Radio. Or you can actually also listen to all the shows on YouTube on the Just Energy Radio YouTube channel. And please do subscribe if you go there. And of course, you can always check them out here on the Inception Radio Network webpage or download the app for your smartphone. Let's see. Any announcements? I just have a couple of announcements of events coming up. One is the Ancient Mysteries Conference being held on September 21st in Fort Wayne, Indiana. My good friend Bruce Cunningham is the one that is running that event. So if you are in that area, please do check it out. They have some great people coming to speak. Unfortunately, that same weekend, or fortunately, or I'm not even sure which one would be which, is the Paranormal Times Paracom, which is being, and see, this week I know where it's at, in El Reno. I'm not really sure where you would get in El Reno, Oklahoma, but it's by Oklahoma City somewhere in Oklahoma, and that is September 21st and 22nd, and I will be at that event. It took a long time to decide Indiana, Oklahoma. I ended up picking Oklahoma. Anyway, today we are going to have a great show. In the first hour, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Michael Witzel about the origin of mythology. And in the second hour, we're going to be speaking with Kane Carroll about the mudras of India. And if you've never heard that word, you definitely need to stick around to the second hour of the show and find out what that's all about. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Michael and get him on the air. Dr. Michael Witzel is noted for his studies of the dialects of Vedic Sanskrit, Old Indian history, the development of Vedic religion, and the linguistic prehistory of South Asia. He is editor-in-chief of the Electronic Journal of Vedic Studies and the Harvard Oriental Series. He has been president of the Association for the Study of Language in Prehistory since 1999, as well as the New International Association for Comparative Mythology. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003 and was elected as an honorary member of the German Oriental Society. So the author of the book, The Origins of the World's Mythologies, Dr. Michael Witzel. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thank you, Rita. I'm fine.
I'm just so glad to have you on the show. I have to tell you, I have been so excited to get to spend some time talking to you about your wonderful book. And you have this very impressive background. And usually when I have a guest come on, we spend the very beginning of the show, if there are new guests to the show, kind of talking about background and history. And please forgive me, but I want to kind of skip through that because I have so much that I want to talk to you about, and just really kind of jump into the meat of our conversation. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So your book looks at, obviously the origins of the world mythology. And so to put this book together, I mean, because this book is extremely comprehensive, but what was your approach to writing it?
Well, it's a long story, you see.
Well, that was kind of why I wanted to skip the bio part. It would give us more time to talk about it.
Yes, right. No, I've noticed certain details long ago, but it came together over the last 10 years. When I was on leave, you see, sabbatical leave, I had enough time to reflect and put it together. So the starting point is, of course, that there are similarities between mythologies across the globe. And these have been interpreted, explained in various ways, for instance, by diffusion from one population to the other, or by common substrates, that is the archetypes, which follows Mr. Jung. So, but I wasn't content with that, because I started to look at things in a historical fashion. And I can say more about that, but this is a short summary of what has been going on.
Well, one of the things that I noticed from working on my own book, and I'm just going to give myself a plug, it's Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, was that when you start looking at the mythology, you start noticing that there's not only parallel stories, but the storyline is the same. And, the ways that other people have tried to explain them away, that they're archetypes, or that each culture made up a story that sounds like one that's across the world, just doesn't make any sense to me. So did you come up to a similar conclusion?
Yeah, exactly. That is one of the major points. You see, I started out from, let us say, the Eurasian mythologies, you see, all the way from Iceland to Japan. And, because of the immigration into the Americas, that includes the Americas as well, and found similarities all over this Eurasian region. And did a detailed study of those. And exactly as you say, I noticed that all of them share a common storyline. And that is usually from the beginning of the world, of the universe, to its end. Yeah? And the humans are, of course, in the center of that, but they come a little later. So you have a storyline which starts with some sort of creation, to use the Christian term. We should probably better say emergence, some emergence of the world, and then several stages, often for ages, or in the Americas, 5 suns, and to the creation or the fashioning of humans and their adventures and so on. So you have a storyline of roughly, I should say, 15 points. They can change a little bit the more we will study them, but we have about 15 points from the actual creation. You see, I can go a little bit into that, up to the end of the world. And sometimes at the very end, you have the hope for a new world to come. That is not found in all mythologies of Eurasia and the Americas, but in some of them. So basically, as you say, we have a sort of storyline from the beginning to the end, which is, as we'll see, not typical for other areas. So I agree with you on that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I always find humorous, and you come very much out of academia, is how do they explain things like serpent worship, where that was venerated, why wouldn't a culture, this one worship a serpent and this one a mountain lion, because maybe that was the most important. Or, there are so many things that we do universally, like God is in the sky and the underworld and the dead are in the earth. And there are these just universal concepts, which doesn't make any sense to me why they would all be the same unless they were all talking about the same thing. And I just can't understand from an academic point of view why it's so hard for them to fathom that.
Yeah, right. If we just look at items that you have mentioned in isolation, of course, you get a haphazard or checkered picture of these items, let us say serpent worship across the world, and you cannot really draw any conclusions from that. Some people do that, some don't. You even may do that in colder climates, but they are isolated features, and the same for others. But once you start looking at the total picture, and I should say a little bit about historical comparison here. Once you look at the total picture, they fall in line, you see, and you end up with the storyline which we have already discussed, you see. Now, maybe I should add a little bit of how to go about it, because there have been, as I briefly mentioned, several approaches. One of them, typical one around 1900 and so on, up to maybe the mid-20th century, was diffusion. So these myths, whatever you might take, you see, let us say serpent worship, would spread from one culture to the next one. And usually people thought of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. And this would have spread all the way up to South America, usually across the ocean, which is a major problem. So this is one typical approach. The other one are the Jungian archetypes, which are supposedly found all across the globe with all populations. But one can question whether a particular archetype, let us say the Great Mother or the miraculous child, or the old crone, etc., whether they are really found everywhere. And secondly, such a archetype, such a mytheme doesn't make a myth, you see. You need much more to fashion a myth out of such a topic. So I don't really follow these two approaches, although the archetype one is very common. You just ask any specialist in mythology, say, okay, these are archetypes. But rather I do it in a different fashion, and that is by historical comparison. So far, people have only noticed similarities, as you said in the introduction. And that's fine, you see. We have been doing that for some 200-300 years, since the mid-18th century, basically. But the picture that emerges from that is as I said, just scattered impressions. Now, what I do is something completely different. I take the mythologies of certain populations, maybe anywhere in the northern hemisphere, from Iceland or Egypt or Mesopotamia, ancient India, ancient China, ancient Japan, or the texts of the Mayas, you see, the Popol Vuh, or other accounts that have been written down by the Spanish in South America, and compare those complete mythologies with each other. That has, strangely enough, has not been done. We have always compared individual myths across the globe, let us say the Oedipus myth and so on, or the Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus goes to the netherworld to retrieve his wife, but not complete mythology. So this is something actually new. And secondly, I do that in historical fashion. That means all our written mythologies, of course, they go back only some 5,000 years, that is ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. The others have been written down a little later. So you only have some 5,000 years of history of mythology, and we should really go back to the so-called African Eve, of the geneticists, so the first ancestor of all of us, wherever we live, and that would be 130,000, 150,000 years ago. So there would be a very large gap between those texts written down 5,000 years ago and the African Eve of more than 100,000 years ago. So how to go about it? Most people will say it is, of course, impossible. We don't have any records. how can we even try? Well, in the end, I tried by trial and error at first, but then developing a scheme. So what you actually do is you take up one of those mythologies, let us say the ancient Japanese mythology of 712, 720 CE, or you take the Edda of Icelandic people, or the Egyptian myth, and compare those with each other. And when you do that, you find those similarities. I have identities that I've mentioned, and you end up with some 15 odd points. So now, going deeper into that, you will see that you can reconstruct some subsets of certain parts of, let us only speak about Eurasia for the moment, and you will see that they lead back in time via further reconstructions. Maybe I should add a footnote here. Other scientists have been doing that. Just think of Darwin and his family tree of beings, or of the linguists who have reconstructed earlier stages of our languages, going back to, in our case, to Germanic and then to Indo-European, you see, covering most of Europe and northern India. Now the geneticists who have reconstructed a family tree along the male line or the female line down to the African Eve. You see, so this approach has been around for quite a while, at least for 200 years, but it has not been applied to mythology. So once you do that, you get a typical family tree of myths and of complete mythologies for all those regions I've mentioned. And so this is something, as I said, which hasn't been done, which is new, and the result is quite exciting, as you said in the introduction.
Well, I'm just going to say great minds must think alike, because I've been reading on your book, and all I can say, my methodology, and I use the same methodology, and it tells this story starting with in the beginning, and I end with the advent of civilization and the rise of the Sumeria and blah, blah, blah. I end it there. That's where I end my narrative. Except mine is more like a cliff note to yours, because your book is just full of all the details that I chose to leave out. How's that?
I think that's, of course, not even a book of 700 pages cannot be complete in this case, because we have to deal with all the mythologies basically, and nobody can be a specialist in all of them. We always depend on other people's translations and so on. So I try to focus on, in speaking only about Eurasia for the moment and the Americas, on these 15 major topics. And we can go into the rest we can talk about the rest of the world a little later. So it is an endless topic, really, you see, and if one would ask details, well, what would the Mongolians say about this? Then I would say, sorry, I know only these 2 or 3 things by heart.
Well, and there's so much more that can be brought into this same thing. You mentioned linguistics, but, then you can look at genetics and the spread of different haploid groups around the world. And there's so many things that you can start looking at and see if there are parallels and ties associated with it, that it really is a huge subject, huge. But let me ask you this. You've mentioned Eve, and that the myths go back to Eve. Is that because that's when, did you pick that date, or you said 100,000 years ago, about 100,000 years ago? Did you pick that date because that's when humanity began to spread around the world? Or was there some other reason that you came up with that dating?
Well, the dating is the one of the geneticists and the archaeologists, paleontologists who have found human bones, you see, from that period onward, 130,000 onward. And geneticists have similar dates. And they coined the nickname of the African Eve. You see, you can call that first mother of all of us by any name you like, but Eve just stuck. So the dates are really taken from genetics and from paleontology, from the evidence of bones of early modern humans, as we say, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens. So the mythology will agree with that. I will say that a little later once we get a little deeper into the subject. So you have, as you indicated, we have parallel developments here. And for certain aspects of mythology, they run perfectly well side by side. Because, most of your listeners will know the theory of the African origin of all modern humans, moving out of East Africa, about 65,000, or some people say 75,000 years ago. So those people marching along the shores of the Indian Ocean eastwards up to Australia and southern China, there were very few, and of course they will have shared a common language and a common mythology. People think that there may have been only some 2,000 people actually moved into southern Arabia, into Yemen and further east. By the way, as a footnote, somebody is just repeating that trip. His name is Paul Salopek. You can find him on the internet. He actually travels on foot. By now he is somewhere in Arabia. So this can, at that stage, you see, some 65,000 years ago, we have a small population that shared many commonalities, and we are outside of Africa, we are the descendants. But these people go back to Africa, and therefore we call our common mother the African Eve. But the parallel developments in language and in genetics can be traced fairly well. I will talk about that a little later, perhaps.
And the part that got me so excited, was, while we were putting our book together, was the whole concept of Australia, or the concept of North American, South American cultures, because they were, populated 65,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. And for the mythology to be with those cultures, it means that they had to have existed at that point in time.
Exactly. We don't have direct evidence, but the spread of humans across these continents shows you exactly what has been going on at early times. For instance, we know that Australia was settled somewhere between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago. There's archaeological evidence. And New Guinea about the same time. So if these people come out of Africa, they must have marched all the way along the shores of the Indian Ocean, Arabia, and then India and Southeast Asia, etc., to reach, let us say, Australia. And Australia has been fairly isolated ever since. I say fairly, there are always some details we could discuss. And they have their own mythology, which is, by the way, as I will say in a moment, similar to sub-Saharan African ones. So once you see that there's this old settlement in Australia, you have a very good idea of when their mythology, and therefore those mythologies that come out of Africa, should have developed. So we from this comparison, you can see that how old our tales actually are. And similar for the Americas, we now know that the Americas were first settled around 20,000 years ago out of eastern Siberia via the Bering Strait, which was dry land during the Ice Age. And all the Native Americans moved into North America and then South America after that period of time. So this, again, is a very good indication of what kind of mythologies were brought to the Americas at that early moment in time. So you get some good points where you can anchor your time frames. And that is very useful because the myths themselves won't tell you that.
One of the things that it made me come to, I don't want to say realize, well, I'm just going to use a myth that everybody knows, and that's and I'm just going to say the biblical story of Noah, and how widely, spread that is around the world. But with what you're saying, that, kind of tied to that is that the flood that we talk about in the Bible wasn't, 13,000 years ago, as many contemporary writers like to say. It's not, 35,000 years ago, kind of like Berosus talks about in the Sumerian Kings list. We're talking about this myth has to be at least 65,000, if not years older.
Exactly. I mean, how would it get to Australia, you see? How would you get a universal flood in the center of the Australian desert, you see? So this is really very old, and it was not in the handbooks. On the contrary, I was also misled at first because they say you don't find it in sub-Saharan Africa or Australia, etc. But once you take a closer look, you find that this particular myth of the flood, the biblical Noah, is really found all over the world, you see, in every continent. And the details will be very interesting because our version, I mean the biblical version here, is, as we know for 100 years or more, very similar to the Sumerian one in Mesopotamia, and also to the ancient North Indian one that is in the ancient most Indian text, the Veda. So these are very similar. You see that Noah or his counterparts are saved from the flood by entering a boat with their relatives or animals, or as the case may be, and they get stuck on a high mountain. In all these three cases. So, for example, in the Bible, it is Mount Ararat, in eastern Turkey. People are still looking for the Ark of Noah. Just go to the Discovery Channel or so. And then in the Mesopotamian version, there's a similar mountain, also roughly the same area, a little south of Ararat. And in the Indian version, again, the boat of the ancestor Manu in this case, which is English man, Manu, the ancestor of humans, got stuck on a mountain in the lower Himalayas, and then he stepped down from there. So the Kashmiris can still show you the mountain and the path. They have that continuous tradition. So these are very similar to each other. But then if you go to other parts of the world, let us say Australia or Taiwan or sub-Saharan Africa, you will again see that some humans escaped the great flood in a boat, or they climbed a mountain, as the case may be. And quite often only 2 people survived. That differs again from culture to culture. For instance, in ancient Greece, there's husband and wife, and they create human beings by throwing stones behind them. But especially in southern China, Southeast Asia, Philippines, etc., it is a brother and a sister, which creates a lot of problems because they usually are not allowed to marry. And then there's a discussion, what shall we do? If we don't have children, there won't be any human beings after us. And so in Southeast Asia, southern China, they usually have a sort of omen. You see, they ask the deity, and then they are told, okay, in your case, it is fine, you can have children. In India, we have a somewhat similar story where the first mortal person denies the request of his sister to marry, and so she calls him, I quote, "Idiot, you are an idiot." And so that's in the ancient most Sanskrit text of India, in the Rig Veda, book 10, 14, and then 10. So eventually, the first ancestor of humans, Manu, has to fashion himself a wife. You see, just similar to Adam and Eve. He does that with melted butter. So we are all descendants of this union between Manu and his wife, as far as India is concerned. But you see the problem. Some people survive, and they have to marry and produce children, and that is us. But this is really found worldwide with certain variations. And the biblical one is closest to Iraq and northern India.
Well, you just kind of gave me the connection, because, he builds a boat, an ark, digs a canoe, but then there's that whole, they climb to the top of the mountain. But I never made the connection that, like, the ark lands on a mountain. So you still have that mountain connection, even if they're in the boat. I was like,
right.
oh.
Right. I mean, that is typical for some of the flood myths, that you get stuck on a high mountain, and it is most typical for these three I've mentioned, the Bible and Mesopotamia and northern India. But in others, in Australia also, we have a boat. Sometimes it depends. Sometimes people just climb a mountain, but in other cases, they actually get stuck on by boat. Yeah.
Right, but see, I never connected the boat on the mountain. But I like that. So you see, I'm going to have to add that to my little thing. But, when we talk about these stories, we're talking, that's already when mankind existed. And so what did you find in some of the creation myths? Maybe you could kind of give us a little summation. I mean, did you... in your mind, I'm going to state it this way, in your mind, based on what you've read, have you kind of come up with some kind of a narrative, and there's not an expectation that this be like, this is the fact of what it is, but, just by piecing all of these myths together, I think it kind of gives you a larger perspective of what may be the real story that's coming down to us. What was that storyline? What was that narrative?
Yeah, right. Speaking only about Eurasia and the Americas for the moment, we have a somewhat murky beginning. It is quite often an emergence out of chaos or darkness, or there's a primordial ocean. And then something emerges. Yeah, it can be a primordial egg or a giant, who is then divided up, forming the sky, etc., and the earth, and so forth. But these first stories about the actual beginning, the emergence of the world, and the sky and the stars, and so forth, is a little bit murky. We can come back to that later. But then you get step by step development. So soon after that, the first sexual beings develop. That is in our tradition. That means in European tradition, usually Father Heaven and Mother Earth. I mean, we still say Tuesday, isn't it? And Tuesday is the day of Father Heaven, Theo, which is Greek Zeus and Latin Jupiter and Dyaus Pitar in India. So this is Father Heaven, and the same for Mother Earth. And of course they have children. They're usually 4 generations or so, 5 in the Americas. And then after that we get a series of primordial deeds. You see, first of all, heaven has to be pushed up, because heaven and earth were very close or lying on each other. I like the Maori version from New Zealand best, you see. It's the same story as we have in Europe. Heaven and earth were in perpetual sexual union, and their children have no space between them. So they decide that heaven has to be pushed up. So one god finally does that. The same is done by the great god Indra in India. And if you like, the Atlas story, you find that in Greece as well. So heaven is pushed up, and so then heaven, he is firmly separated from earth, she. And the Maori version says, and then he cried bitter tears, and that is the rain, because they are separated forever. So this is one of the features that has to be has to happen, otherwise we couldn't live here. The next one is, of course, there's sunlight. You see, because at first there is no light at all, and there are many versions of that, whether you go to ancient Japan or Vedic India, that is the sun or dawn is hiding in a cave, and she usually has to be delivered from that cave, and since that time we have sunlight. So not like in the Bible, you see, may there be light, but there is a deity of the sun or dawn who has to be delivered from the cave, otherwise you wouldn't have sunlight. Then the next one is usually killing the dragon. So this is a sort of monster, usually, let us say in Greek myths, one of the third generations of Titans, same in India, who has to be killed to make the world inhabitable and also fertile. So these are some of the primordial deeds usually done by as we say in the Americas, a trickster deity, a demiurge, who actually makes the world inhabitable. And after that, you will get the creation of humans. And that is a very interesting topic, because if remembering the Bible, Adam is made and Eve are made in the beginning, Eve from Adam, Adam from clay. But that is not the normal type of myth for Laurasia. We are all descendants of a sun deity. So let us say the Japanese emperor is still the ultimate descendant of the sun deity, Amaterasu. And so in many cultures you get this kind of concept, ancient India, Egypt, and so forth. So,
hey, Michael,
yes.
I'm just looking at the clock, and we need to take a quick break. Okay?
Right. Okay.
Okay. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Michael Witzel about his book, The Origins of the World's Mythologies, and we'll be back with Michael after these words from our sponsor.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
You're listening to IRN, the Inception Radio Network, Chicago, Illinois.
Are you sensitive to energy? Want to explore the world beyond the five senses? Looking for a new career as an alternative healthcare practitioner? Then the Institute of Applied Energetics, Medical Intuition, and Energy Medicine training programs may be right for you. Our comprehensive curriculum provides students with a deep understanding of how to detect, evaluate, and transform the subtle body, as well as techniques for correcting energetic imbalances that may underscore a person's ability to experience radiant health. So if you are sensitive to energy, contact the Institute of Applied Energetics right away. Be a catalyst for changing the way healthcare is done around the world. Visit www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com and start your new career today.
Don't have a computer? Is your internet connection down? Don't worry. Use your trusty landline or cell phone and dial our call and listen lines at 832-280-0830 or 786-837-2262 to listen to the Inception Radio Network 24/7. Again, those numbers are 832-280-0830 or 786-837-2262. For the Inception Radio Network, I'm MJ.
The crossroads in your life and discover alternative solutions to your deepest concerns at soulhealer.com. So whether it's a physical problem, an emotional issue, a question about work, or troubles in your relationships, naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise can help you. Bring peace, harmony, and health back into your life. Schedule a session today. Visit soulhealer.com right away and live the life you've been dreaming of.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
And welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and we've been here talking to Dr. Michael Witzel about his book, The Origin of the World's Mythologies. So, Michael, before we were so rudely interrupted by that break, you were starting to talk about the creation of mankind, humanity, in the mythological record. And we all obviously know about the Adam and Eve story and being created from clay. But then you started going into this whole concept of being created as part of the sun deity. And that's where we kind of got cut off. So maybe you could pick up there?
That's right, yeah. So in the Eurasian and American, Native American mythologies, we are usually descendants of a sun deity, as the case may be. But that is pretty clear. And from there, humans proliferated across their various lands. Now, once you have humans, of course, evil also has to enter the world, and it usually does by humans exhibiting some sort of hubris. And the usual punishment is the flood, about which we have talked earlier. So, and after the flood, then the repopulation of the world by humans, and then usually local history starts somewhere along this line, as the case may be for the individual traditions. But usually at the end, we have a destruction of the world, and sometimes a hope for recreation of a new perfect world, and of course of individual beings. So that is in short the storyline we have been talking about, of some 15 odd points. But if you like, I think we should talk also about the rest of the world, because so far we have only been talking about Europe, Asia, and the immigration into the Americas. So that's a large part.
And actually, that was my next question. Wow.
Good.
I mean, because in your book, you have two different areas, and I have very bad phonics skills, so please beware. Laurasia, which you were talking about, and then Gondwana.
Right.
Which from what I was looking at in the book was Africa, South America, Australia, if I recall correctly. What characterizes or separates these two groups?
Yes, that was a big surprise. You see, I didn't expect that at first when I had done the initial comparison. I thought, let me look at the rest of the world. But maybe about these two terms, they are just convenient geological terms about the primordial continent, and they are not political, etc., nothing of that sort. So I chose those two terms. You see, for the northern area, Laurasia, that is Mauritania in Canada and Asia, obviously, and Gondwana is an Indian term, actually, but the geologists use that one. It defines central India. Now, so we have these two areas. Of course, they have nothing to do with humans. It's just geology. I merely use the terms. So the southern one, to be quick, the Gondwana area is, as you said, in mythology, it covers sub-Saharan Africa. Northern Africa has Semitic and Berber, etc. myths, so they are not connected. So it covers sub-Saharan Africa, and then the Australia and New Guinea. Not so South America, because South America has, of course, been settled from the north, you see, from North America, so they don't belong there. And so the southern mythologies, the Gondwana mythologies, are very interesting, as you just indicated, because they are different. And as I mentioned, I was really surprised to notice that. So there are some typical differences that jump at you as soon as you start to read African or Australian myths. And the most prominent one is that there is no creation story and no story of the end of the world. The world was just there. It is a flat and hot place, and people are only interested in the origin of humans, but not where does the world come from. So that was one thing you notice immediately, and you can read any account, also accounts by those who have written about African mythology. They say those populations are not interested in the origins of the world. They are interested in the origins of humans. And similarly for Australia and New Guinea, and some small islands in between, you see, like the Andaman Islands near Burma and Indonesia. So the question was, why do these mythologies differ so completely? They also differ in another aspect, in that they don't have the same kind of storyline that we have been talking about earlier, these 15 odd points. They have some individual tales about the first creation of humans in various forms, and here, interestingly, you get the origin of humans from clay. So I wonder how that got into the Bible. But anyhow, it's a typical sub-Saharan African story, and Australian story from clay, or from trees as well, quite often. So the first humans may also step out of trees, Sometimes it is the man from tree and the woman from clay, as the case may be. But that's very typical for the southern mythologies. You get a little bit remnant of that in the northern one, but just isolated small tales. But it's typical for the southern mythology. So you might get this kind of motif, origin of humans, and what they did. And just as in the north you get some primordial hubris, they do something wrong, whether by mistake or intentionally. And then, just as in the north, they get punished by a flood. But there's no continuous storyline as we have seen in the northern mythology, just a few bits and pieces. And you get a sort of trickster deity who introduces culture. See, that's a universal. So the southern ones are an important way of counter-checking what we have found for the northern, the Laurasian mythologies. And they clearly are different from each other. Now, if you put that into context, it immediately becomes clear why that should be so. Because
explain it to me, because I couldn't quite figure that out.
Well, I can tell you a story. Once I had developed the Laurasian type of mythology long ago, by now, 20 years ago, and I stepped out of the plane in America and bought the first journal there. What was it? The Atlantic, I guess. And they were talking about the genetic developments, movement out of Africa. I said, oh, very good, exactly as I needed. Yeah? Because once you look at archaeology, paleontology, and genetics, you see, of course, that we all come out of Africa, East Africa. And the southern mythologies they are remnants of the original human mythology, which is still found today in much of sub-Saharan Africa and Australia and New Guinea. So these are really remnants, while the northern type, the Laurasian type in Eurasia and the Americas, is based on the same kind of stories, but they have put them into a new framework. We can talk about that later on. So the important thing for us is really to see that the southern mythologies are more ancient. You see, they are more archaic than those we have been talking about so far. And some motifs overlap, and we can see that those have been further developed in a different way in the north and in a different way in the south. So it fits the genetic and archaeological evidence quite wonderfully. So obviously, as you can see, I was quite pleased to notice these congruent developments, and consequently I have a long chapter in the book about archaeology, genetics, and linguistics, etc., because they run really very well parallel to what we have seen in mythology.
So when you're talking about the mythology of Gondwana, are you talking about that their mythological base is just a series of kind of independent myths, or do you think that from that mythological base there's just a lot of stuff that's missing that we no longer have access to in an ancient or more modern form?
Well, the second part of your question is the most difficult to answer, of course, because the southern mythologies have been recorded only for the last 200, sometimes West Africa, 400 years. So we only have documents by missionaries and local colonial administrators that go back roughly 200 years. So theoretically we wouldn't know at all what had happened in those enormous periods before that time, because those myths were not written down until recently. But once you start your same kind of comparison that I've been talking about earlier, you can reconstruct their mythologies as well and go back in time up to beyond actually 65,000 years. So that is a problem for any comparison of myth. The same would of course apply to, let us say, some myths recorded in the Amazon. They also have not been written down. But as soon as you put them into a comparative framework, you see the similarities, the congruencies, etc., and the story becomes much clearer. So in the south, we have these more or less isolated tales. There is no text, let us call it oral text, that has the same kind of storyline and as we find in the north, whether it is in Iceland or anywhere else in the north. That just doesn't exist. So there wasn't anybody, you see, very strangely enough, there wasn't anybody in sub-Saharan Africa or in Australia who, so to speak, sat down and said, okay, let me put it all together, all our stories that we have, and tell them to my students, which is a topic we should also talk about briefly, because this is shamanistic teaching, I think.
I mean, we are running out of time so quickly that I'm just going to have you come back and we can take this to the next level, because I feel like we're just barely. I mean, I have questions in the chat room like, I don't think we're going to get to it. I don't think we're going to get to it. So let me ask you this question, because I just am curious what you think. But how do you account for, the amazing weapons? You're a Sanskrit scholar, so I'm going to throw this one at you. Like the Vimanas or the Sabas. I love the whole concept of the Sabas, and I think I said that right. And some of the, like Vishnu's disc. I mean, it's some of these weapons that you find not only in Indian mythology, but around the world. How do you account for that coming from such an ancient period of time?
Well, stories about our deities, your gods and goddesses, are of course of that nature. Wherever you go, they can do amazing things which are beyond human possibilities. And some of them overlap as far as various cultures are concerned. Each of them would have to be studied in detail. For instance, you mentioned the Indian Vimanas. You get stories like that in the great epic or later on. But in detail, they often look a little bit different from what we might think. So it is more like, Elijah's chariot in which he went to heaven, you see. No description. But in the Indian text also, they don't give you the technology involved. You see. But once they do, it becomes very interesting. I could go into one case from 1000 CE. You have a light airplane built out of light wood with mercury fires inside and so on. And then you need a mantra to make it fly. And then the author says, no, I won't tell you the mantra, then everybody could build it. But he says, if you really want to know, you go to Yavanas. They are masters in it. Now, unfortunately, Yavanas are originally Greeks and later Western neighbors of India. So the author in 1000 AD says, go to the Western neighbors and learn from them. So there are some descriptions like that, you see, but usually they are more of a mythological nature in all sorts of tales. So this is true for many cultures, obviously. And last point perhaps, because we have to close pretty soon. The major one I would like to make at the end is, once we employ this kind of reconstruction, this allows us to have a window into the deep past, which the other sciences cannot provide. I mean, archaeological finds are always open to interpretation. The genetics don't tell us what the people thought at the time. The bones as well, you see. But here we actually get tales which are very old, you see, and that is what I really like about it. We get a window into our deep past, the commonalities of all humans still living now, and secondly also the nature of the major world religions, because they all have this kind of storyline still. So they depend on Stone Age mythology. This is something which we can tell the various religions that are around today.
I'm looking at the clock. Okay, I have time to throw in this one last question.
Yes.
So, who do you think the gods of myth were? Do you think they were ancestors that we have worshipped? Do you think they are figments of our ancestors' imaginations? Do you think they were extraterrestrials? What do you think?
Well, comparing all those mythologies, you can see that these faculties are usually attributed to our ancestors here, who normally much better, powerful, etc., than we are, except in the Americas, there it's usually the other way around. So it is typical for mythology, to imbue them with these faculties. You see. We wouldn't know about extraterrestrials unless we see them.
I mean, it just seems like when you read these stories that the level of technology, I'm just going to say it that way, just kind of in a generic slant, the level of technology that they had and their understanding of the world in which we live in. You read a lot of these Indian texts and they talk about a multidimensional universe and there's so much information that we're just really starting to re-understand that it's hard to imagine that early Homo sapiens came up with that material and then just passed it on, unless that culture that existed back then, maybe they didn't have things in the material realm, but had things more, they dealt more in the intuitive, natural, living in and with nature realm, which would, I don't know. Any thoughts?
Right. We always underestimate our ancestors, you see, and now even the Neanderthals get remake these days. You see, they are not these brute beasts that we have learned in high school, you see. So their faculties become clearer and clearer now, you see, and the same is, of course, also true for our ultimate ancestors in Africa. They quite obviously they thought deeply about us. Where do we come from? You see, who are we and where do we go? That is a basic human question that you can find all over those mythologies. So they have been thinking about that for, let us say, anatomically modern humans for the last 130, 150,000 years, and we are still struggling with the same question. And as far as the extraterrestrials are concerned, it is just another answer to the same question. You have seen all these various groups, the Raelians or whoever, who try to answer our questions with this kind of scenarios. In the case of Raelians, of course, not so good outcome, yeah. But I
like it better than archetypes.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Definitely. These terms are all very abstract. You see, even Campbell with his All-American Hero is just one reconstruction, you see. But we all struggle with that kind of question. Yeah? So especially, ultimately, it's, of course, the question of death that people are concerned with and try to answer in various ways. And obviously, so far, there is no perfect answer to that. Maybe we'll all live for 120 years, but that's only 120 years, okay?
Okay. And if somebody wants to get a copy of your book, The Origin of the World's Mythologies, where can they pick it up?
Oh, I guess in all major bookstores. It has been published by Oxford University Press at the end of last year. And I think the paperback copy is somewhere around $34, I think, for some 700 odd pages. So it's a heavy book in both senses, but you get it.
But it's a really good book. Like I said, I don't want to say I couldn't put it down because I just have like craziness going on in my life right now, but I just have been captivated by your very analytical approach to a very interesting and kind of cumbersome, crazy-making topic of sitting there comparing all of these myths together, because I remember doing my little project and my head spun a lot trying to organize it, and it's not an easy project, and yours, your book's amazing. So people buy it. It's a good book. If you like my book, you'll like his too.
No, thank you very much, Rita. I'm very glad to have been on your show, and I hope people get interested in the topic.
Well, we do a lot of shows on ancient civilizations on this show, so I think that they will. So it's all good. All right, Michael, I am going to let you go. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I will talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Until
next time. Yeah.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
great. Thank you. That's Dr. Michael Witzel. His book is The Origins of the World's Mythologies, and we'll be back with Kane Carroll after these words from our sponsors.
Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.